Welcome to Recruiter Wins, your bite-sized 15-minute podcast with your host, Zach Gallinger. This is the show where every guest answers one simple question. Tell me about your biggest recruiting win. You'll hear everything from gut-wrenching candidate conversations to game-changing business development wins. Real stories with lessons you can actually use in your next search.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Recruiter Wins. My name is Zach Gallinger and I'm the founder of Talent Hero Media, a digital marketing agency that works exclusively with recruiters. In this podcast, we sit down with a highly successful recruiting expert to ask them a single question. Tell me about your biggest recruiting win. Our guest today is George Blomgren, recruiting manager at Kinsa Group. He has 20 years of talent acquisition experience, including 7 years with Kinsa, working with food and beverage companies. Welcome to the show, George.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, let's dive right in now with the question we ask all of our guests. Tell me about your biggest recruiting win.
Excellent. Love it. So recently, my biggest win was for a beverage manufacturing company. Kinsa specializes in food and beverage, as you mentioned, located in central Wisconsin. There were some challenges that we had to overcome, which is why I'm particularly proud of this one. I would say the four big challenges were: one, this was a new type of hire for them. They make beverage. They realize that they are now purchasing more dairy than they had ever purchased previously. So they asked me to find them a director of dairy sourcing. But again, this was unfamiliar territory for them. So there was a kind of a learning process that happened through the recruitment. Second, the location. Central Wisconsin, kind of a medium-sized town. It can be difficult. I mean, many of the positions we work on require relocation because our clients are often looking for very specific technical skill sets that the odds of finding somebody commutable is very slim. So that adds a whole kind of dimension to the challenge. The third, procurement is a sort of position that can be done remotely. It was really because of company culture issues. They have a culture that is very much based on personal interaction and spontaneous meetings and brainstorming, but that was very important to them. Whereas a lot of the procurement people that I found and talked to were really big on working remotely. That's what they had been doing. That's what they wanted to do. And finally, the company in question had very low turnover, great company. But as a result, especially at a senior level, their hiring processes were a little bit rusty. So we really had to kind of polish them up and fine tune them just to make sure that we really didn't scare off the best candidate.
That's a very good story. And I really appreciate the structured answer. I like a good numbered list. And I think there's a lot for us to kind of dive into. So let's kind of just jump into my first follow-up question. How can recruiters kind of identify when a client doesn't know what they don't know about a role? You mentioned this is kind of their first hire in this dairy space as a senior position. Like, what techniques can you use to help clarify clients' needs when they are starting out maybe from a vague understanding of what they're looking for?
Yeah. So, of course, if the client doesn't fully know what they don't know, I don't necessarily know it either. So it's kind of a mutual learning process as we work through things. So some of the ways of spotting when an employer is not necessarily all that clear on what they're looking for. First, a job description that sounds overly vague. Perhaps it looks like it's a template that they found on the web or it's AI generated. That's kind of a tip off that there might need to be some additional digging that has to be done. And some of the ways that I like to get it kind of moving the process forward and honing in on the right type of candidates are questions like, what are some of the important industry trends that you guys are aware of? Or what's a prior employee? Where did they fall short? What are some of the things that you'd like to see in a candidate for this position? And very specifically, what is the problem that you really want this new employee to solve? That's a great question to begin to kind of get past the job description. Another thing that's very important, and I think any recruiter knows this, is with each candidate that I submit, getting specific feedback about why they rejected that candidate, if they do. That is always very helpful. Inevitably shakes some things loose that just didn't come up in previous conversations, weren't necessarily on the job description. So just, a real quick, what did you like about the candidate? What didn't you? And then one thing, I kind of talked about this being a mutual learning process. One of the best pieces of advice I got early in my career was from a recruiter who told me, if you're recruiting for a position that you don't fully understand yet, if you get a candidate on the phone who perhaps you reject them for some simple reason, like the salary's wrong or the location's wrong, but you can tell that they are a real expert, resist the temptation to get off the phone as quickly as possible. and just have a good conversation. Learn everything that you can from that candidate. And that actually happened in this situation where we are able to kind of hone in. This isn't really just about dairy, it's about milk purchasing and very specifically about ultra filtered or UF milk. So that was very helpful insights that I think really helped us move things forward.
Yeah, that sounds like a very niche role. And I can understand why there's not going to be a lot of people who really have much to share. I completely agree with you on that last point about just talking to people. Like some of the best insights I've ever acquired from my business has just been talking to leads, some of whom I kind of knew right off the bat weren't going to be a good fit for our business. So I get that for sure. Let's talk a little bit about relocation. So you mentioned this is a small town or mid-sized town, probably not super desirable place to live. How do you sort of assess whether or not like you're going to be able to find a person to relocate or actually just get the specific person in mind that you to actually move to a new place?
I try to never form an opinion up front because I'm often surprised. I'm currently working on a position that is literally in the middle of rural Texas. And I've been surprised at just how many candidates have been like, and the salary is not even fantastic, but a lot of candidates have expressed an interest in this. So I try not to go into that with any preconceptions. Now, the relocation thing is always challenging. The latest statistics that I've read is that only approximately 3% of candidates are even willing to relocate, period. And most likely, I can't back this up with any data, but smaller towns in rural areas are probably across the board a little bit less favorable. Now, for some candidates, that's exactly what they're looking for, but it adds a definite wrinkle to my job as a recruiter, an executive recruiter. I often have to deal with this. So I have to be part real estate agent and part travel agent. And I never want to mislead candidates. So when I have a location, I always do some research about that location, learn, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I can be very, tell the candidate. But the other thing I have to keep in mind is when relocation is on the table, for many candidates, I'm not just recruiting them, I'm recruiting their family. So I need to be able to address the concerns their family might have, such as local school systems, crime rates, recreational activities. If DEI is important to a company, two things that often are not, people don't think about is just the availability of different types of food markets and restaurants and houses of worship. That can be very important to diversity candidates. So it adds a definite wrinkle to my position.
Are you doing all that research like on the place that they're moving to, like going into the weeds on all those topics?
I have to. I don't want to have to get to tell a candidate, you know what, let me get back to you on that. So I want to be pretty familiar with a location. When if DEI comes up, really go that step farther with those other kind of aspects. But I need to be ready to talk about the location and address concerns that people might have. I also need to understand, ask questions like, is it, and I always apologize in advance. I say, I apologize that I'm going to ask you some what seem like very personal questions, but my client really needs to understand what does relocation entail? So single, do you have a partner? Is it a family? Are you a homeowner or a renter? Now, on that second one, another follow-up question that has really just started coming up a lot more often recently is, are you going to keep your home and rent it, or are you going to sell it? So that is also significant. So learning more about that, asking the question, is your family on board with this? Have you actually talked to your family and said, hey, I'm, talking to somebody about a position in St. Louis? Because I've had more than one recruitment go off the rails when an otherwise perfect candidate who seemed to be an offer was even extended is like, oh yeah, I talked to my family and they're not okay with this. That's a conversation that should have happened much earlier. Some other questions I like to ask is, what ties might you have to that location? Because that's going to help ensure retention. Do you have family there? Do you have friends there? Have you been there before? In the case of northern states like Wisconsin, where I live, have you been there in the winter before? It'd be a very important question.
Yeah. As someone who lives in Toronto, I can certainly appreciate that. I mean, I don't like being here. So yeah, I can imagine Wisconsin winter. If you're from California or Texas, for example, that's got to be a big transition.
Exactly.
All right. I really liked all the detail you gave there. So thanks for that look into what it takes to really make sure someone understands what relocation entails. I think I have at least one more question for you. You mentioned that like this company didn't have a lot of turnover. How do you sort of coach a client when they're like making this new sort of senior level hire when they're not really used to it? Like, I think obviously moving efficiently, keeping everyone engaged is important. So like, what's your plan there?
Well, the first thing I have to establish is whether or not this client, any given client, wants to be coached. There are some clients that welcome the insights that Kinsa, with 40 years under our belt and a lot of very tenured recruiters, we have a lot of insights that we can share. Not all of our clients want those insights, and that's fine. But the ones that do, and in this case, fortunately, the client was very coachable and welcomed all of the input we had. So the first thing is kind of establishing the need for that coaching. So reminding them that whatever the actual unemployment numbers look like, the good candidates have options and they know it. So the good candidates are going to be the first ones that get scared away by any sort of hiring experience, employee experience that is not friendly, that does not seem candidate centric. So kind of establish the importance of this right up front, and then begin to talk about this, and sometimes proactively whenever possible, sometimes reactively. So the next candidate who goes through that. I'll give you an example. One interview that my candidate had with a couple of their senior level leaders, it was a video interview. The leaders did not introduce themselves at the beginning of the interview. And my client had actually arranged that interview, so they did not provide that information up front. Now, that sounds like just sort of maybe a kind of a polite and nice to have. But if you think about it, because he had no idea who he was talking to, he couldn't really tailor his answers to what the CFO would want to hear versus what the head of HR might want to hear. So again, my client was very receptive to that type of feedback. In some cases, it was more about, we'll make sure that doesn't happen again sort of a thing. And also in this case, the candidate who they ended up hiring, he's a fantastic candidate, was very a good sport about the entire thing, and recognized the fact that, yeah, this is a good thing that this client has very low turnover and is not necessarily expert at this process.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And I'm just trying to imagine jumping on a Zoom call with people and everyone just sort of staring at you and you're sort of expected to go before you know anybody. That's kind of intimidating. So I can see why that's not a great idea. And last question for you. You mentioned that a lot of people in procurement wanted to work from home, wanted to sort of keep it remote, but this company insisted on having somebody on site. So how do you kind of know when what your client is saying is being said for a good reason about having someone on site versus like more of an outdated policy that they might want to consider changing to make the right hire?
Obviously, the trick is pushing past the requirement on the job description and finding out what's behind that requirement. And in many cases, this is just kind of a dictate from somebody in corporate who's like, our employees are going to work on site. So I wanted to find out, the reasoning behind this. And this client, fortunately, was very good at articulating our culture. So one of the things that they explained to me is that, well, very specifically, the owner of the company is there fairly often, does not even have an office. And they said, we very much have a culture of what we like to call kind of hallway decisions. These are spontaneous people bumping into each other in the hallway. And that's really where the synergy happens. Big things happening just spontaneously in these face-to-face meetings. As soon as they kind of explain that, I'm like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. This is not just asking you to be on site for the sake of being on site. If you really want to participate in and be the type of strategic leader that this company is looking for, it's just not something you can do remotely.
No, that makes sense. Have you ever been able to convince a client who wanted to do on-site to go remote for somebody, or is that a big ask?
It is a big ask. I mean, I've certainly tried. I think maybe I've been successful maybe a handful of times. The thing that I like to remind them, just to kind of put it in perspective, is just a very simple question. So do you want to only hire like the best person you can find who lives within commuting distance? Or do you want to expand that talent pool dramatically, exponentially to the entire United States, or maybe even beyond that by allowing remote work?
Yeah, no, that's a very good way to frame it. I could see how that could potentially sway some people. Yeah, that's sort of all the questions I have today. Thank you very much for joining us, George. I really found this conversation to be quite insightful.
Zach, thank you. I appreciate your time today.
All right, have a good one.
So long.
Thanks for listening to Recruiter Wins. Please join us again when we ask our next recruiter one simple question. Tell me about your biggest recruiting win.